Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do each Sunday. You can ask gardening questions down in the comments below this video, and I pick from those each week. The questions that I'm about to do are actually from 2 Sundays ago. I did last Sunday's and the one you're watching now from that video. And this next week, I'll go back and pull questions from last week's and this week's for next week's question and answer video. I hope that makes sense. But I had to shoot 2 of these from the one from 2 weeks ago, and I'm amazed I got like 45 great questions between the 2 videos out of that. So thank you guys very much for participating in the question and answer videos. Super helpful to the channel, and thanks a lot for that. As you're watching this, I should be on my way back from Europe. I went to visit my son for a week. I didn't take a camera, I didn't take a computer, I didn't take anything. That's why this video was shot a week and a half ago, was so that I could go over there without thinking about plants, and I could just spend some time with my son, who's living in Germany for a year, and who I hadn't seen in a few months at this point. So that's where I will have been, and I should be arriving back home about now to get back in here to the garden and get some other things done. Let's see, there'll be Learn to Garden content immediately right when I get back home for those of you who have bought the Learn to Garden video series over on my website. So let's jump into the questions again from 2 weeks ago, and there'll be more up-to-date questions this next week. Okay, so somebody asked this is a really great question. Can full sun plants get too much sun? It's a great question because something that is a full sun plant for me in zone 7B in Raleigh, North Carolina, down in Houston, Texas, is potentially not a full sun plant. It's potentially a part shade plant. So it depends on the plant, and it depends on where you are in the country. I shot an annual, all about shade annuals video and all about sun annuals video, and those videos were somewhat difficult because when you have a YouTube channel and people are watching you from all over the country and then from other countries, the things you say can have an impact that you didn't mean to really have. I mean, I'm growing snapdragons, pansies, and violas in the wintertime, and way up in Canada, they can grow them in the summertime, right? It's a full sun annual for the summertime. And then for me, they just completely cook in the middle of the summer. So it's a lot about what the plant is and where you are in the world as to whether it's actually a full sun plant or not. We have a lot of plants in this garden that I have in part shade conditions that absolutely, as you moved further north, could go in more and more sun. And as they went further and further south, they'd have to go in more and more shade until there was probably just not a place to hide them in deep enough shade where they would still perform as they're supposed to perform. So it's a great question, and yes, there's a limit to how much sun a lot of the full sun things can take, and you need to be on the lookout in your area if you're in those areas that are in Dallas and Houston and some of those southern places where the sun is really quite aggressive for a very long period of time, from March to March through October, where you're still having heat. Those places might not be places where some of the full sun plants you see on gardening channels, can be in the full sun in your area. And some of that's trial and error. I frequently will say, in consultations, and it's okay to buy one and try something somewhere. You don't have to, the worst case scenario to you being a happy gardener would be to buy 12 of something that costs $40 a piece or something like that, and put them in and then find out that it wasn't enough. It was too much sun, or it's too much shade, or it's too wet, or it's too whatever it is for that plant. It's okay to buy one and just see what happens with it. Live with it for a season and see how it performs, and save yourself a little bit of heartache, because you can always just pop that one out of the ground, move it into a little more shade or whatever. Let's see. So somebody has a very thin soil layer, clay, very heavy clay, and then they get down to bedrock very quickly. They've got clay mixed with a little bit of rock, and then they get down to bedrock pretty quickly. I don't know if they're new construction where they took off some topsoil or whatever, or just this is the area that they live in. I have no idea. They wanted to know if raised beds were best thing for annuals. It's a tough call. Yes, in the short term, you can probably grow annual plants, whether that be vegetables or annual flowers or perennial flowers, best in raised beds in all likelihood. But it wouldn't stop me for a minute from trying to improve my existing situation. So I would try to get some wood chips and put down a thick layer of wood chips, compost, whatever. I'd get something going on top of this thing where we can get some earthworms and other things working for us to get this soil in better shape. But in the short term, you will probably have more success having things in raised beds. But the rest of the area, you could go ahead and, you could put in some raised beds, and then in between those raised beds, put in wood chips and, as paths and that kind of thing, and see if you could start to work on that soil. Because I appreciate raised beds. My neighbor over here gardens with, his stuff in raised beds, but I really, at the end of the day, want to improve my soil. I want to be able to be self-sufficient if I ever needed to be self-sufficient. And the best way to do that is to improve the soil that you have. So do both at the same time. It'll just take a little while for the worms and grubs and everything else to improve your existing soil. Let's see. So somebody asked do street lights affect vegetable plant growth? So they want to put their vegetables where there's close to where there's a street light. There's a lot of studies on this. I think it does more damage to insects than it does to plants. I mean, it does disrupt plants in ways. I've read it disrupts plants' hormones, but I've never seen any. I've lived around streetlights my whole life. I've never seen any what I would call negative impact. I've still gotten tomatoes, with streetlights. So I don't think you're going to have that big of a problem. I do worry about our moths and things that require night light and night navigation. All this lighting is not that great for them, for sure, more so than the plants. Doesn't mean it's no negative impact to the plants, but I think it's more to our insect populations, which are unfortunately in decline. So somebody has I kind of talked about this a little bit last week. I'm going to do a Redbud specific video. They bought a Golden Falls Redbud like mine. I think mine's right at about 8 feet tall, 7.5 feet tall. Theirs is about 4 feet tall. My buddy Rob over here bought one that was kind of short too. And they wanted to know how to make it taller like this one. You're gonna have to stake a piece straight up, but you can't stake one of these long ones, they break. You're gonna have to find a new piece of growth somewhere to stake it up. I would definitely only buy one of these weeping redbuds at the height you wanna keep it, just because it will take you some work and some time to restake them yourself. Okay. But again, I'm going to make a Redbud video, and I will show that in the video, that you can turn a 3 to 4 foot one into this, but you're going to have to find something up there that you can bend straight without breaking, which is the complicated part. Okay, so tons of wait and see winter damage questions. So people are still struggling with, is this alive or is that alive? May 15th is probably my cutoff date, where I'm going to give up on a perennial that hasn't come back out of the ground. Every day though, I find another perennial that has, come back. Shrubs leafing out, how they're going to leaf out. I mean, to say your shrub is alive, but it only leafed out from one side or something, isn't necessarily, best case scenario. But I would give everything till about May 15th. We never chunked anything at the nursery till after May 15th. And so just used to that over the years. Sometimes things get damaged in the winter and it takes them a little bit of a reboot, but they may have that energy left to do it. But definitely give them a couple more weeks. Okay, so somebody asked about, they've had some flooding up in, I think it was in Maine. Was it in Maine? I think it was in Maine. They've had some flooding. They had 4 to 6 inches of water standing in their yard for some period of time. Will that kill the plants? It's obviously not good for them. Flooding, plants can actually be completely submerged underwater for about 24 hours, and then after that, they'll die from that. So they can take some submerging. 6 or 8 inches of water at their roots won't kill most shrubs unless it stayed that way for a prolonged period of time. But if it's happening and it's at least not standing in water after a week or so, it shouldn't kill your shrubs. Some of your perennials that are still kind of semi-dormant probably are not going to like that at all. Those are the ones that are probably in jeopardy from dying is your tender thing, you know, more tender things, non-woody plants. But the woody plants that have been there for some period of time can probably take some inundation for, you know, for a week or two and survive that. They may lose some leaves, they may get a little bit of, they may lose a root or two under the ground somewhere, and that has a negative impact on what you're seeing on the top with some yellowing leaves and that kind of thing. But most of them will survive that, but that's a lot of water. Let's see, okay, and then here's another redbud question. I get so many redbud questions. So somebody has a forest pansy redbud and it doesn't have a leader, and you won't see a leader on a redbud. Very early on, they'll branch off in several different directions like that. They establish a leader by never establishing a leader. You know, you'll get a piece that goes this way, and then a piece that goes this way, and then a piece that goes this way. It amounts to a leader, but it's not a straight up trunk. And they wanted to, so it doesn't have a leader and it's way off balance. Like there's one piece that's sticking way out further. They wanted to know if they could prune that off. I would prune that off just for the safety of the tree. If you got a tree that's that far out of balance, it has the potential for wind or ice or something like that to damage it in the future. So I would try to rebalance it some. On your redbuds, you can just go back and cut back to a bud along the stem, and they're pretty good about leafing out, you know, along the stems. Redbuds, it's not their favorite thing to be pruned. I will say that, so don't go crazy on one pruning them. I limb this one up from the bottom is about all I ever do. But taking one limb off to rebalance it to save it from damage in the future is definitely worth doing. So somebody asked about screening plants for alkaline soils. So, you know, they live in an area where their soil pH is over 7 and wanted to know what the best things for that are. I think they were already taking a couple things out. There are a lot of viburnums, and I've tried to say this in more videos. We did a video a week or two ago, and it was about cleaning up the suckers and things, and I talked about hellebores being alkaline soil tolerant, clematis being, that's saying both now, being more alkaline soil tolerant, and I also said it about the lilac being more alkaline. I'm trying to say it occasionally. If I do know something is more alkaline soil tolerant, I'll mention it in a video. But you definitely boxwoods, some viburnum. Cherry laurels are a great choice. This was in a shady space, so cherry laurels will be a great choice for you. They will take alkaline soils, and they're evergreen, and they part shade areas are great for them. Any kind of tall growing boxwood would help. Lilacs, again, I just said, are another one that you can use. But there are actually quite a few things that will take alkaline soils that impart shade spaces like that. Let's see, so somebody, shrubs for part shade. Okay, somebody wants shrubs for part shade in damp conditions in Charlotte. So they know they've got this spot that's just always gonna be wet. It's probably between the two houses. I always had these spots landscaping where they put the houses so close together, and then they basically make a ditch between the two houses to drain the water out from between the two of them, and that bottom piece of it always stays super wet, so the mower bogs down in the bottom of it. And I had the police called one time. I was trenching an irrigation system. We were putting in an irrigation system, and I was using the trencher on one of those slopes, and like houses are like 12 feet apart, and there's a little slope between them, like 6 feet on this guy's side, 6 feet on that side. And I'm running the trencher, and the trencher's so heavy that it just keeps going down the hill, I reach the bottom of the hill, and then I'm able to turn it and go back up. So my 1-inch piece of PVC pipe just bends a little bit as I was working it toward the back garden. Turns out I went about 2 or 3 inches onto this other guy's land. And I didn't know. I mean, you can't really tell, but I figured the bottom of the ditch was the lot line. Turns out he owned 2 inches of the other guy's upslope on the other side. And they went crazy on each other. The police were called. It was long. I had left the job for the day. It was during the night. That was, police presence and all kinds of stuff over, the trencher going 2 inches over onto this guy's property. It was like, man, way to meet your neighbor there. What was all that about? But damp, so I'm very familiar with these spots where you get that constant dampness. A lot of our native plants, and I mean a lot of our native plants, are actually riparian plants. So my viburnum nudum, which will be on a Garden Plants with Jim Putnam video coming up Viburnum nudum is a great riparian. We call them riparian plants, plants that will put their toes down in the water. Clethra, Cephalanthus is another one. What else? Beautyberries. There are a lot of our native, and we have complicated spaces like that, lean on native plants, and a lot of our native plants actually don't mind sitting in moist conditions. Don't ever plant them in the bottom, in the wettest spot. Plant them up a little higher and mound them up just a bit, as if you're worried about the water, okay? And then they'll put their toes down in it, rather than you sinking them up neck deep in it right off the bat. So do it that way. They're not used to it. They were grown in a container in a nursery. They weren't grown in a wet space. And so they're going to have to acclimate back to what is their actual native condition. Itea virginiana, Henry's garnet. When I see Itea, just the straight species Itea, it's growing in the water. It's not, and then we put it in the driest places in our front gardens. So that's another one. Let's see, had another sunshine ligustrum defoliation question, which is I answered in last week's. They should leaf right back out, but it was in last week's, so a little more detailed on that. Somebody's got a yellowing green giant arborvitae that they planted. They planted it up high because there were some roots from something else near it, and wanted to know why it was yellowing. If it's getting that interior browning that conifers do, it probably got a little bit dry. It's always possible that something's overwatered when it's yellow, but usually I look and say if it's yellow on the outside, on the newest growth, sometimes that can be overwatering. And if it's kind of yellowing or browning on the interior part of it, usually that's underwatering. Nothing is 100% in horticulture, but that's when I'm looking at something, kind of how I'm judging it. If it's yellow on the new growth, too much. Yellow on the old growth, not enough. I imagine that because you mounded it up some, it's probably gotten on the drier side. It probably will be totally fine. And I'll answer these questions carefully with watering, because when I say it likely got dry and that's why it shed some, then that person might respond by going and watering it 10 times. It was dry like a month ago. And now you're seeing the result of it. But go check it before you start watering it again. I'm always cautious answering those questions because I don't want somebody to go and do the exact opposite and start drowning the thing, which is very, very easy to do. Okay, let's see. So somebody has like 5 Japanese maples they had planted in containers. One of them has not leafed out yet. Should they cut it back, the dead parts back to the living parts, and should they transplant it into the ground or something like that? Just wait for it. Let the container dry out slightly between waterings and don't overwater it, but wait for anything. Don't double down on stress. I think I've said it many times on this channel, doubling down. When you get a stressful situation with a plant, a browning, yellowing thing, don't go out and dig it up and move it, because, it's just everything doubles unless you're rescuing it from water or something like that. Like if it was too wet, that was the reason, and you were going to dig it up and get it to higher ground. Yes. So I don't want to say never, but for the most part, when you have stressful things happening, walk away. I told a gentleman, I was speaking at the Ralston, during the question and answer part, I had a gentleman ask me if he should do all kinds of things to some plant that he was asking about. And I think it was a Japanese maple as well. And I told him, walk away from it. Just walk away. You're the biggest threat to it. When things are going wrong with your plant, sometimes you're the biggest threat to it. So if it's going to leaf out, it's going to leaf out. I wish you the best. I've had, when you spend that kind of money on something like a Japanese maple, it's kind of stressful when it's not leafing out. So somebody asked about dividing hosta once they're completely leafed out. I put up a dividing hosta video a few weeks ago. You can still pop any hosta out of the ground in the spring, even when they're fully leafed out, and still divide them. Keep in mind, they do 90% of their growing right now, and so that they're going to do for the season other than flowering. And when you dig one up now, when you divide it and you put it back in the ground, that's how it's going to look the rest of the season. It might have had a little bit of growth, but it won't look its best. That's why I try to get it done as they're emerging in the spring, before they've really uncoiled and, put out the big leaves and everything. So I try to do it early because of that, because again, it's going to look like it's going to look once you divide it, but you can still do it. You won't hurt them. I've taken Hosta out of the ground and left them laying on the sidewalk for 2 days and then come back and divide them and put them in the ground. Not recommending that to anybody, but they're overall pretty tough plants outside of deer and a few disease problems. Somebody asked about general meetups. Like I was in Atlanta a few weeks ago and I didn't tell anybody I was in Atlanta while I was there. Yes, at some point when I go out on the road, I would like to do some meetups, meet up with people, and maybe meet at a garden or something like that. It's something I've always had in my mind, just haven't followed through on. So somebody has their Stellar Ruby Magnolia. This is a good question. So their Stellar Ruby Magnolia has budded up. They're in zone 8 and or 8B and I'm in 7B. Theirs just has buds that haven't opened up yet, and mine has been in full bloom and it's almost finished. So they heard me say that in a video and then want to know why theirs wouldn't have already bloomed in zone 8 if mine's bloomed in zone 7. But then there's a clue in here. They planted it last fall. And I say frequently, I can't say this enough, none of your plants that go in the ground in that first year will be all they can be. They just won't. They're going to go through they're potentially going to go through awkward things. They might drop their flower buds the first year and not open them. They may open them late. They may open them early. Depends on potentially where the plant even came from as to where it was in its cycle of, winter and spring, just based on where it was grown in the country, that kind of thing. So don't worry. As long as the plant is not fading in some way, don't worry about a plant that's not doing what you saw in the magazine cover the first year it's in the ground, okay? Or what you're seeing on a YouTube channel or anything like that, because that's just kind of normal. So they'll either open or they'll fall off, and then next year it'll bloom normal. Okay, so somebody asked about edging. They want to edge their turf. They were talking about my edging around these 2 turf areas. This will be a patio, but that turf area in the front garden are always kind of neat. And I used the trenching shovel to create a trench edge. And I've got several videos on trench edging on the channel. They wanted to know if they would do the same thing just around a wooded space for their lawn. Yeah, absolutely. It looks crispy. It also, by going in and taking the shovel, let's see if I can pick it up. By taking the shovel and cutting along the edge and kicking that soil back up into the bed, the shallower roots from your trees will also be cut, once or twice a year, and will prevent some of those roots from getting out into your lawn and causing some damage out in your lawn or your beds or whatever. But it also creates a differentiation between those fibrous roots that come from the trees, getting out and competing with your turf and stealing the water from your turf if you do have a nice turf area. Okay, so somebody has a lantana they brought home, put it on the south side of their house, and the leaves are drooping on it when they set it there. This question is now 2 weeks old, so I'm guessing it's adapted pretty quickly to the full sun. This was an issue when I sold plants at the farmer's market. We had an inside space. In order to have an outside space to sell plants, you had to rent the inside space, which was under a shelter. Well, there's a difference between shade plants and under a shelter where there's no direct light whatsoever. And we always wanted to have our flowering things up near the front to, for people walking down the aisle, but those plants with flowers on them wouldn't hold up very well under that shelter. Okay, so we would have to rotate plants in and out and in and out and in and out. They were also, the plants that were under that shelter were losing their ability to tolerate the sunlight. We talk about acclimating plants to the outside from the direct sun. If you start seedlings inside and you bring them outside, the sun can damage them if you take them directly out into the full sun. I would imagine that's how it happened with that lantana, is wherever you purchased it from, it may have been in, a part shade under a shelter, could have come from a greenhouse grower that, had a little bit of shade cloth on top of their greenhouse, could have been in a truck for 2 or 3 days coming across, maybe it was grown in California and was shipped all the way to wherever you bought it and it stayed in a truck for 4 days. That's within the realm of possibility. All of those things can add up to when it goes out into the full sun, it goes, oh, like this. Your lantana will be fine because it's, loves full sun. And it'll take a day or so to adapt to it. It probably won't get burned either because it has a thicker, leathery leaf, but some things can just flat out be burned. So, you know, yes, it goes back to that very first question. How much sun is too much sun? Any amount of sun is too much sun if you've not been in the sun for a while. It's like taking, you know, going to the beach and immediately, you know, in June and immediately taking, you know, going down to a pair of shorts with no sunscreen on. You're going to get burned. Same thing with plants. Exact same thing with plants. Okay, so somebody asked me my opinion on multiple cuttings in containers. And I've talked about this before. One of my, let's see, do I have one that's like that? Yeah, actually, this Viburnum obavatum, this is kind of funny. This is a very old Viburnum obavatum that I was going to shoot a video for, but then I neglected it for too long. It has 1, 2, 3 plants in the container. So it had 3 cuttings were taken and then planted into that container in order to grow it faster at the nursery. And I'm not a big fan of it at all, but it's the world we live in. I mean, it's so many plants that I look at now have multiple plants growing in the container. And it's really, at the end of the day, a situation where if they put 2 in the container, they'll compete with each other and race up faster and fuller and finish faster. And so it's a, you know, it's a dollar and cents thing at the end of the day. But I'm not a giant fan of it, if I'm being truthful. And then last question for this week. Again, ask gardening questions down below this video. And I'm going to go back and pick from last week's and this week's that you're asking here for next Sunday's video. Again, these are all great questions. You know, it's amazing you can get variations of similar questions too, and I think that's helpful too sometimes to come back around and answer a question that just got asked in a different way. The last thing for this week isn't really a question. Somebody wanted an update on all my trees. So when I get back into town here, I will I'll go through and do a video on all the trees. That redbud you can see right there, and you can probably see my Tamukiyama Japanese maple. You can't see the Tokyo Tower fringe tree, but there's a bunch of smaller growing trees that were planted into this landscape, and they're all thriving. They're all doing pretty well, so I'll show them off in a video pretty soon. So thank you guys for watching, following along with the channel. The question and answer video doesn't work without your great questions that you ask, so keep them coming. A lot of the questions frequently start with something like, I've got a silly question, or I have a dumb question, or this is probably a dumb question. There's no such thing. There's absolutely, positively no such thing as a bad question. Everybody has to learn somewhere in some way, you know. So don't ever think that your question is silly, or, you know, I guarantee you somebody else has the same question and they've been too shy to ask it. So ask away. Thanks for watching.